starting at number 10, Corocotta. In the years around 25 BC, the Roman general Publius Coricius was trying to finish off the conquest of northwestern Spain. It should have been easy. The Cantabrians were a rugged mountain people, poorly organized on paper, outarmed, outnumbered, outfinanced on paper. In practice, the Cantabrian Wars turned into one of the most vicious asymmetric conflicts Rome had ever fought. Augustus himself came to Spain in 26 BC to supervise, so certain was he that his personal presence would settle the matter. He was so wrong that he fell ill from the stress of the campaign and had to retreat to a coastal town to recover, leaving his generals to grind on year after year against tribesmen who refused to fight the kind of battle Rome knew how to win. And at the center of the trouble was a single man whose name the Roman historian Cassius Dio preserves for us. Corocotta. The name likely means hyena, borrowed from a word for a fierce African animal, and it was probably a nickname either given by his own men or coined by the Romans in grudging respect. What is certain is that his raids were causing so much damage that Augustus, the Emperor of Rome, personally set a reward on his head. Dio records the figure, 1,000,000 sesterces. To put that in perspective, a Roman legionary at the time earned around 900 sesterces a year. Corocotta's head was worth roughly 1,100 years of a soldier's wages. It was the kind of sum that could set up a wealthy Roman family for generations. The bounty went out. Roman officers and Cantabrian collaborators combed the mountains looking for him. Weeks passed. Nothing. Then, one morning, a lean, bearded man walked calmly into the Roman camp. He asked to see the emperor. He was Corocotta, he explained. He had come to claim the reward. Understand what this meant? There is no version of this story where Augustus should not have executed him on the spot. The bandit had personally humiliated the imperial administration. He had cost Roman lives. He was the wanted man himself, standing there smirking in front of the most powerful man in the world. Every legal, political, and psychological instinct in the Roman military machine should have kicked in at once. This was a chained walk to the block at best. But according to Dio, Augustus laughed, he was so struck by the sheer audacity of the man that he did what nobody in the camp expected. He paid him the full 1,000,000 sesterces. And then he let him walk out of the camp, a free and very rich man. Dio uses the story to illustrate Augustus's clemency. He is comparing Augustus, in his own subtle way, to the ferocity of the emperors of his own day, especially Septimius Severus, and painting Augustus as a ruler secure enough in his power to laugh at a bandit's nerve rather than fear it. Modern historians debate whether it ever really happened. Some argue Corocotta may not even have been Cantabrian at all, but a North African bandit whose animal nickname the Iberians adopted. Others treat the story as pure moral fable invented by later historians to make a philosophical point. But the fact that Romans told the story at all, generation after generation, tells you what kind of legend Corocotta had become. A hyena so bold, he walked up to the Emperor of Rome and said, "That is my head. Pay me for it." And Rome, dazed by the sheer nerve of it, opened the treasury and did. 2,000 years later, there is still a statue of him in Santander, the capital of modern Cantabria, and his story is passed down orally in Cantabrian families from grandparents to grandchildren. A folk hero preserved by the very people the Romans had come to subdue. At number 9, the Bagaudae. In the 280s AD, in the villages of central Gaul, something strange began to happen. Peasants stopped paying their taxes, rural landowners began finding their estates raided, Roman patrols riding out into the countryside began not coming back, and when the imperial administration tried to figure out who was responsible, the answer came back in a word that would haunt Rome for the next 170 years. Bagaudae. The name is Celtic, and it probably means fighters or warriors. The Bagaudae were not a tribe. They were not even, strictly speaking, an army. They were a shadow, a movement of the rural poor joined by army deserters, runaway slaves, and dispossessed farmers that Rome could never quite pin down and never quite kill. The first great Bagaudae Rising. in 285 AD was serious enough that Emperor Diocletian sent his co-emperor Maximian with veteran legions to crush it. The leaders, Amandus and Aelianus, may even have proclaimed themselves emperors of their own breakaway state in central Gaul, minting coins and holding petty courts in occupied villas. This was not a village riot. It was, in the Roman legal language, a rival regime. Maximian defeated them in a hard campaign, and Roman writers dismissed the survivors as nothing more than latrones, bandits, and their followers as deluded rustics. That was the official line. The reality was that the Bagaudae had built a shadow bureaucracy out of the ruins of Roman governance. They collected their own taxes, they tried their own cases, they elected their own leaders. Roman elites did not know what to call them because their political vocabulary had no category for a peasant army that governed itself. The root causes of the rising, taxation, insecurity, the collapse of imperial protection in the countryside only worsened as the decades rolled on. Every time the Western Empire tightened its screws to pay for another emperor's civil war, another wave of small farmers slipped their obligations and ran to the woods. By the 430s AD, the Bagaudae were back, this time in Armorica, modern Brittany, and in the Ebro Valley of northern Spain. A leader named Tibito rallied a peasant army large enough that Rome had to call in Hunnish cavalry under a commander named Litorius to help crush it. Another rebellion, in 448 AD, produced perhaps the strangest Bagaudae figure of them all, a doctor named Eudoxius, who was mixed up in the movement and fled to the Huns rather than surrender. Think about that trajectory. A trained physician, a man of letters, chose to throw in with peasant rebels rather than serve the collapsing Roman order. That is the kind of decision that tells you the empire had already broken in places its bureaucrats could not see. In Spain, the local Bagaudae eventually allied with the Suevic king Rechiar, a unique alliance between a Germanic warlord and rebel peasants that Roman historians could barely bring themselves to describe. Even the Christian writer Salvian, watching the empire collapse, could not muster his usual moralism against the Bagaudae. He argued instead that the misery of the Roman world was all due to the neglect of God's commandments and the terrible sins of every class of Roman society, sins that were driving good men into banditry as their only refuge. For nearly 2 centuries, the Bagaudae were the invisible enemy of the Western Empire, a shadow state that Rome fought over and over and never really beat. When the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, the Bagaudae did not need to be defeated. They simply became the local order. They had outlasted the state that hunted them. At number 8, Cleon of Gordiucome. Some criminals get executed, some get pardoned, and a rare few pull off something no bounty hunter could ever quite catch. They change sides at exactly the right moment and end up as royalty. Cleon of Gordiucome was the masterclass in that art. Cleon was born in a small village in Mysia in northwestern Asia Minor. As a young man, he took to banditry with an enthusiasm that impressed even hardened highwaymen. According to the geographer Strabo, who knew the region intimately, Cleon operated out of a fortress in the mountains around Mount Olympus. That, Anatolian one, not the Greek. From there, his gang plundered caravans, robbed towns, and made themselves a permanent thorn in whichever government happened to claim the region. In the 40s BC, that government was Mark Antony's. Antony, sole master of the Eastern Roman world after the civil wars, needed reliable local strongmen to help him hold Anatolia against Parthian raids. Cleon offered his services. In 40 BC, when the renegade Roman general Quintus Labienus invaded Asia Minor at the head of a Parthian army, Cleon's men harried the invaders in the mountains, tying them down and buying Antony time. Antony rewarded him with grants of land. The bandit chief was becoming a landowner. In one of those small moments that turn a criminal into a nobleman, Cleon was quietly folded into the Eastern Client network of Rome, no longer a wanted man, but a paid asset. Antony also apparently granted him a priesthood, that of Jupiter of Bretonus, and made him ruler of a small district in Mysia called Moraine. The former highwayman was collecting titles the way he had once collected caravans. But then came Actium in 31 BC. Antony was about to lose. Cleon read the political winds with the instincts of a veteran robber and switched sides. He offered his services to Octavian, the future Augustus. Octavian accepted. In exchange, Cleon was granted an even bigger prize than land. He was made priest-king of the temple state of Comana in Pontus, dedicated to the goddess Bellona. Understand what this position meant. Comana was one of the great sacred cities of the Anatolian world, a temple state where the high priest was effectively a small king controlling thousands of temple slaves and vast tracts of dedicated land. Only the greatest men in the region held the office. A former bandit was now the sovereign ruler of an entire sacred territory. Priest, monarch, and de facto governor rolled into one. He renamed his home village Juliopolis in honor of the Julian family. He styled himself a dynast. He was the wanted man who won. His reign lasted exactly 1 month. According to Strabo, Cleon violated a religious taboo, allegedly by eating pork in the sacred precinct of Bellona, and died shortly after. Some Romans muttered that the goddess had punished him for his impiety. Others suspected poisoning by rivals in the temple hierarchy, who had watched the outsider parachute into their sanctuary and objected in the only way that mattered. Strabo, writing not long afterward, seems himself to lean toward the divine explanation, treating the death as a moral parable about the limits of ambition. Either way, the man who had turned a career of banditry into a crown lay dead in his own temple within weeks of putting it on. The lesson of Cleon of Gordiucome is a strange one. Rome could be beaten, bribed, outnegotiated, and ultimately joined by its enemies. But the gods apparently still kept their own accounts. And a bandit could rise through every rank of Roman politics only to be brought down in the end by the taste of a forbidden meal. At number 7, Selurus, the son of Etna. This one has no plot twist. Only a stage. Selurus was a Sicilian bandit chief who ran his operations out of the wild volcanic country around Mount Etna in the mid-1st century BC. His nickname, Son of Etna, told you where he lived and how afraid you should be of him. He plundered towns, ambushed travelers, and led a war of his own against Roman order until sometime around 35 BC, he was finally captured. What Rome did with him is one of the most surreal executions ever recorded in the ancient world, and we know about it because the geographer Strabo was in Rome that day and watched the whole thing. Selurus was brought to the forum. There, in the middle of a scheduled gladiatorial spectacle, engineers had built a wooden platform. Painted and shaped, the platform represented Mount Etna itself, complete with rocky slopes, smoking vents, and the illusion of a summit high above the crowd. This was the age before the Colosseum. The great amphitheater of Vespasian and Titus would not be built for another 100 years. Selurus' execution took place in the open forum of the Republic in the political heart of Rome, in front of aristocrats, priests, foreign ambassadors, and ordinary citizens crowded onto benches. The date was around 35 BC, in the twilight years of Antony and Octavian's power struggle, and the crowd was as much a political statement as an audience. Selurus was hoisted to the top of this fake mountain in chains before a roaring audience. He stood on the summit, the son of Etna, atop his mountain, one last time. And then the engineers pulled a lever. The whole structure was rigged to collapse on cue. Trapdoors sprung open. Beams gave way. The fake mountain crumbled out from under Selurus' feet, and he dropped, still in chains, into a pit hidden beneath the platform. In that pit were cages full of wild animals, panthers or lions, prepared exactly for this purpose. The cages were rigged to break open on impact. Selurus landed among them. The rest, as Strabo carefully recorded, was over quickly. Think about what this execution meant. Rome was not just killing a bandit. Rome was staging his death as theater, complete with set design, special effects, and a symbolic reference to the very geography of his crimes. This was the birth of a Roman art form. The condemned man's death would soon become an entire genre of public entertainment. Emperors would order convicts dressed as mythological figures, cast as Orpheus torn by a bear, or as Icarus falling into wildfire, or as Prometheus with an eagle actually tearing at his liver. The idea that punishment could double as narrative theater begins, in a sense, with Selurus. Strabo, who saw it happen, records the moment with the strange clinical detail of an eyewitness who cannot quite believe what he is watching. It was the Roman entertainment industry treating banditry as a plot point, and it worked. The crowd loved it. The son of Etna was consumed by the very mountain his name had claimed, and a Greek geographer took notes for posterity because even by Roman standards, the spectacle was unusually creative in its cruelty. Every bandit executed in the arena for the next 500 years, every criminal thrown to lions in front of a cheering crowd, was in some way a descendant of what happened to Selurus in 35 BC. His name is almost forgotten today. But the shape of his death survives at every Roman amphitheater ruin in the empire, in every Colosseum trapdoor, in every arena engineered for a spectacle instead of a battle. The bandit who died on a fake volcano became, without anyone quite intending it, the prototype for the darker face of Roman public life. At number 6, Tacfarinas. In 17 AD, a Roman auxiliary soldier serving in North Africa made a decision that would keep the Emperor Tiberius awake for the next 7 years. His name was Tacfarinas. He was a Numidian from the semi-nomadic Musalami tribe of what is now southern Algeria and Tunisia. He had served in the Roman army long enough to learn how it fought. He knew the drills, he knew the marches, he knew the weaknesses. And then, one day, he walked away from his cohort, took a handful of comrades with him, and disappeared into the desert. Within months, he had turned a small band of deserters and disaffected tribesmen into a full-fledged army. And what made him uniquely dangerous was that he trained them Roman style, discipline, formations, ambush tactics adapted to open country. He had taken Rome's own methods and turned them against the empire. The war he waged terrified the imperial administration. North Africa was not just another province. It was the granary of Rome. The wheat that fed the city passed through its ports. Any disruption there registered as bread riots on the Palatine. Tacfarinas raided estates, sacked farms, ambushed Roman patrols, and vanished back into terrain he understood better than any legionary. He defeated 3 successive Roman proconsuls. The first, Marcus Furius Camillus, beat him in a set-piece battle only to watch him melt back into guerrilla warfare. The second, Lucius Apronius, saw a full Roman cohort destroyed in the field and punished the survivors by decimation, executing 1 in every 10 soldiers as punishment for their disgrace. Even Legio IX Hispana, the legion that would later vanish from Britain, was pulled all the way from Pannonia to help crush Tacfarinas. Nothing worked for years. Then Tacfarinas did something so audacious that the Emperor Tiberius himself was said to have exploded with rage. He sent an embassy to Rome. His envoys carried a formal demand: give him and his people land, and the war would end. Treat him as an equal party in a negotiated settlement, king to king, ruler to ruler. Tiberius was incandescent. Not even Spartacus, he reportedly said, dared to send ambassadors to demand terms from the Roman state as if he were a foreign sovereign. Tacitus, the historian who preserves the moment, treats it as one of the most humiliating diplomatic overtures the empire had ever received. A deserter from a Roman auxiliary cohort was writing letters to the Emperor of Rome requesting a peace treaty. The emperor rejected the demand and reinforced the province. It took until 24 AD for the war to end. The final proconsul, Publius Cornelius Dolabella, adopted Tacfarinas' own tactics against him. Small mobile columns, deep patrols, surprise strikes at rebel camps at dawn or dusk when the tribesmen were least prepared. Dolabella refused to give Tacfarinas a set-piece battle in which the rebel could disappear before the killing blow. Instead, he chased him. He wore him down. He hunted him the way Tacfarinas had once hunted Roman patrols. In a night raid at Ozia, in what is now Algeria, Roman troops finally cornered Tacfarinas himself. Rather than surrender to the men whose army he had once served in, he charged into their spears and was cut down. 7 years, 4 proconsuls, and 2 full legions had been required to kill 1 former auxiliary who had walked away from his post one afternoon. His name still appears in North African historical memory today, celebrated in modern Berber culture as a resistance hero. The Musulami, his tribe, would rise once more in 45 AD, only to be defeated by a Roman general named Servius Sulpicius Galba, the same Galba who would one day briefly wear the imperial purple. After that, Trajan, in the early 2nd century, would end the Musulami threat forever by forcing the nomadic tribe to become sedentary. It took the might of 3 emperors spread across 3 generations to finish the work Tacfarinas had made necessary. At number 5, Maternus. Some criminals rob, some raid, and a very small handful decide that the only proper target for a career like theirs is the emperor himself. Around 185 AD, a Roman soldier serving somewhere in the western provinces did exactly what Tacfarinas had done nearly 170 years earlier. He deserted. He took his comrades with him, and he began building an army in the countryside of Gaul. His name was Maternus. Herodian, the historian, who tells us most of what we know, records that Maternus recruited deserters, runaway slaves, prisoners freed from local jails, and impoverished peasants. Within a couple of years, his rebellion had escalated into what Roman writers were calling the Bellum Desertorum, the War of the Deserters, sweeping across Gaul and northern Spain. Cities were sacked, provincial governors were driven from their posts, legions were pulled from the frontiers to hunt him. And then Maternus, cornered by the Roman response, made a decision that even his own men found unbelievable. He would not run. He would not surrender. He would kill the emperor. His plan was remarkable for its imagination. Every March, Rome celebrated the festival of the Great Mother called Hilaria. It was a wild spring carnival in which the ancient laws about clothing and rank were suspended. Anyone could dress as anyone else. Slaves could wear senatorial togas. Ordinary citizens could dress as Praetorian guardsmen. In the chaos of the parade, no one could distinguish the true from the false. Maternus recognized what this meant. If he and a hand-picked squad of his men infiltrated the crowds in Praetorian uniforms, they could get close to the emperor without any guards suspecting a thing. Then, at the right moment, they could strike. He got his men across the Alps in small groups moving through the empire under false identities. It was, in effect, an infiltration operation carried out with the precision of a military intelligence mission, executed by a man who had learned all of it from the Roman army itself. His deserters worked in teams. Some traveled as merchants, some as pilgrims, some as returning veterans making their way home for family business. They gathered in Rome, one by one, disappearing into the enormous population of the imperial capital and rendezvoused in safe houses that Maternus had arranged in advance. He acquired the uniforms. He briefed the plan. He walked his own men through the streets they would need to know at the festival and possibly rehearsed the approach to the imperial box itself. And then, at the last possible moment, some of his own conspirators betrayed him. Herodian is blunt about their motive: jealousy. They preferred, he wrote, to be ruled by the emperor rather than by a bandit chief. Some of them may have calculated that if the plot succeeded, they would just be swapping one master for another, and the new one would have no legitimacy and no long-term future. Others may simply have panicked at the enormity of what they were about to do. Whatever the exact mix of motives, the informer walked into an imperial office and told everything. Maternus was arrested. He was beheaded within days. His head was likely displayed to make the point that even a war of deserters that had shaken 2 provinces could be ended by a single tip-off. The festival went ahead as planned. The emperor watched the parade, and Rome quietly buried the fact that a deserter from a border legion had come within days of executing the ruler of the known world at his own carnival. The whole crisis was later known in Roman writing as the Bellum Desertorum, the War of the Deserters. And, though later biographers of the emperor barely mention it, the sky was said to have burned red the year before it began, an omen that Roman writers noticed only in retrospect. At number 4, the Bucaloi. In the marshes of the Nile Delta, in the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, there lived a community of herdsmen, the Romans, called the Bucaloi. The word meant cowboys or cattle people, and it was a Greek label for the semi-wild pastoralists who worked the wetlands where the great river split into a maze of channels before reaching the sea. The delta was almost impossible for outsiders to police. Its papyrus swamps and shifting islands sheltered anyone who wanted to disappear. And in the year 171 or 172 AD, the Bucelloi decided to disappear no more. The trigger was a Roman centurion arriving to collect taxes. According to Cassius Dio, the Bucelloi met him with a stratagem so cold-blooded that it turned into legend. A group of the herdsmen dressed themselves in women's clothing, veiled and disguised, and approached the centurion carrying what they claimed was gold. The story was that they were the wives of Bucelloi men come to ransom their husbands from arrest. The centurion, either greedy or gallant, let them approach. And then the veils came off. The Bucelloi struck him down where he stood. Then they seized his companion. And here Dio's account moves into territory that has disturbed readers ever since. They did not simply kill the companion, they sacrificed him. Ritually, they swore an oath over his entrails, and then, according to Dio, they ate them. Whether the cannibalism is literal, symbolic, or a hostile Roman exaggeration meant to prove the Bucelloi were savages, historians still argue. Some scholars point to older Egyptian religious traditions that did include ritual sacrifice and argue Dio's report reflects at least a shadow of an actual practice adapted for a moment of extreme political defiance. Others suggest the whole scene was pieced together by later Greek novelists like Achilles Tacitus, who wrote lurid fiction about cannibal herdsmen and whose imagery Dio may have absorbed. What is not in doubt is what happened next. Under the leadership of a priest named Isidoros, described by contemporaries as the bravest of his generation, the herdsmen's rising exploded outward. Local farmers, the fellaheen whose backs had bent under Roman taxes for generations, joined them by the thousands. Rural Egypt, which had for a century looked like the very picture of peaceful Roman provincial life, was suddenly in flames. The rebels crushed a Roman force in open battle. They swept toward Alexandria, the second city of the empire, the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, the port through which most of Rome's own grain supply flowed. Marcus Aurelius, according to the sources, contemplated whether the city might actually fall. That is not a small statement. Alexandria was one of the crown jewels of the imperial system. Its loss would have been catastrophic economically and symbolically. Only the arrival of Avidius Cassius, one of the ablest generals Marcus Aurelius had, saved the province. Cassius, an officer with deep experience of the eastern frontier, refused to meet the Bucelloi in a single battle they might win. Instead, he divided them, separated the tribal factions from each other with careful diplomacy and offers of terms, and picked off their strongholds one by one until the movement collapsed. Isidoros disappeared into the papyrus swamps that had bred him. The centurion and his companion were never recovered. And a legend was born that would linger in Greek and Roman writing for centuries of the marsh dwellers who ate the men sent to tax them and nearly ate the grain capital of the empire itself. At number 3, Lydius The Isaurian. The Isaurians were a mountain people from the wild interior of southern Anatolia, known even to their neighbors as unpredictable, violent, and almost impossible to govern. Rome had a saying about them. It was easier to invade Persia than to occupy Isauria. Whole Roman armies had marched into their mountains and come back with less than they had gone in with. And in the years around 278 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Probus, an Isaurian bandit named Lydius proved exactly why. Lydius had been a robber since childhood, raised in what one late Roman writer called the brigandage custom of his people. He and his gang plundered the provinces of Pamphylia and Lycia so thoroughly that villages recorded their sufferings in stone inscriptions, honoring local men who had held out against his depredations. Probus finally sent a full Roman army after him. Lydius, unable to face legions in open battle, retreated to a place that would test every siege engineer in the Roman military: the mountain fortress of Cremna in Pisidia. Cremna sat on a natural precipice. On one side, ditches so deep that even a scaling ladder became a rumor of a plan. On the other, sheer cliff. To besiege it, the Romans had to build platforms, drag artillery uphill, and settle in for a long, exhausting campaign. Then Lydius did something that revealed exactly what kind of man he was. Inside Cremna, food was tight. Lydius did not want to feed non-combatants, so he ordered every useless mouth expelled from the city. Women, children, the elderly, the sick. Anyone who could not fight was herded to the walls and pushed out. The Romans, seeing what was happening, refused to let them pass through the siege lines. The expelled civilians were caught in the no-man's land between the walls and the trenches, condemned by their own defender to die in an open ditch. Many were shot by their own former neighbors above them for approaching the Roman positions. Many died where they stood, of hunger, of thirst, of exposure. It was a war crime so extraordinary that even the pagan Roman historians, no strangers to hard warfare, singled it out for horror. In its cruelty, it foreshadowed acts of siege warfare that would be repeated across the ancient and medieval world, but Lydius seems to have been one of the first commanders in a Roman-era source to do it this openly, this deliberately, and without any pretense of military necessity. But Lydius's cruelty finally turned against him. Inside Cremna, he had a specialist, a ballista engineer, one of the men who worked the great Tertian-powered artillery pieces that shot spears the size of javelins. Roman siege artillery was one of the most sophisticated technologies of the ancient world, and the men who knew how to operate it were valuable in any camp, brigand, or imperial. This engineer accidentally misdirected a shot at some point during the siege, either missing a target or hitting one of Lydius's own men. Enraged, Lydius had the man mutilated as punishment. Zosimus does not spell out exactly what was done, but the word suggests something disfiguring and permanent, the kind of injury designed to shame as much as to hurt. That decision cost him his life. The engineer, savagely humiliated, slipped over the walls one night and defected to the Romans. He told them exactly where Lydius liked to appear. There was a specific loophole in the wall where the bandit chief would come regularly to peer down at the besiegers, always at roughly the same time of day, always framed in the same window of stone. The engineer knew the routine because he had helped design the defenses. He drew a diagram, he explained the angles, he told the Romans exactly which piece of Roman engineering, ironically, would be needed to make the shot. The Romans set up a ballista, or, in some accounts, a scorpion, a smaller precision shooting piece, ranged it precisely on that loophole, and waited. According to the historian Zosimus, the next time Lydius's face appeared in the opening, the bolt struck him in the head. He died on the spot. His army surrendered within hours. And a Roman engineer he had personally maimed had lined up his life through a slot in the wall like a hunter waiting on a deer. The Isaurians, as a people, would give Rome trouble for at least another century, but their most notorious bandit chief was killed by his own decision to torture the wrong specialist. At number 2, Viriathus, long before Rome ever put a bounty on Bulla Felix or Corocotta before Tacfarinas, raised his desert war, or the Bucaloi drank blood in the papyrus reeds. One shepherd from the mountains of what is now Portugal did something no other criminal on this list ever managed. He made the Roman Senate consider, seriously, whether it could beat him at all. Viriathus was a Lusitanian, born around 180 BC. According to Livy, he had risen through the classic Iberian path from shepherd to hunter to soldier. In 150 BC, the Roman proconsul Servius Sulpicius Galba invited thousands of young Lusitanian warriors to a supposed peace conference. Once they were gathered, Galba had them massacred. Viriathus was among the few who escaped alive. 3 years later, in 147 BC, the survivors elected him their leader. What he did with that leadership over the next 8 years should have been impossible. He annihilated praetor after praetor. In one ambush after another, he crushed Roman armies commanded by Vitellius Plautius, Claudius Eunomanus, and Gaius Nigidius. In some engagements, the Romans lost 4,000 men in a single day. Viriathus's hit-and-run tactics, learned in the Sierras where a shepherd learned to disappear into rock and cloud, mocked every doctrine the Roman military manual contained. His men would strike a Roman column at dawn, retreat before the legionnaires could deploy ambush that pursued at a river crossing, and vanish into the mountains before the survivors could regroup. He turned Iberia into a landscape the Romans could not navigate without dying. At his peak, he controlled most of central and southern Iberia, moving his headquarters wherever a Roman force approached, always faster than the empire could pin him. Roman commanders described him with grudging respect. He wore the same clothes as his men, he ate the same food, he slept on the ground. When his soldiers won plunder, he took only the smallest share. It was the discipline of a shepherd who had never learned to steal from his own flock. Rome sent Quintus Fabius Maximus Servilianus against him. Viriathus captured him along with his army, and in a mercy that would haunt the Romans for years, released them all under a treaty recognizing Lusitanian territory as a free ally of the Roman people. The treaty was ratified in Rome itself. Viriathus was formally declared a friend of Rome. For a brief moment, a mountain shepherd had negotiated an equal peace with the imperial republic. When the Senate then repudiated the treaty as beneath Roman dignity, arguing that no Roman general could bind the state to terms, with a bandit, Viriathus's opinion of Rome hardened permanently. He had trusted the paperwork had lied. From that moment on, the war became personal. In 139 BC, the next Roman commander, Quintus Servilius Caepio, understood that Viriathus could not be defeated in the field. So he did what Rome had always been prepared to do when honor became inconvenient. He turned to bribery. When Viriathus sent 3 trusted friends, Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus, to negotiate peace, Caepio corrupted them. He paid them a fortune to murder their own leader. Different sources name different Roman officials as the one who did the actual bribing. Some point to Caepio himself, others to Marcus Popilius Laenas, who had been dealing with earlier peace overtures. The 3 assassins came from a Turdetanian city called Urso, and had names that marked them as Celtic aristocrats or mercenaries, men who had allied themselves with Viriathus at some point in the war, and who now saw an opportunity for personal enrichment. They accepted. They returned to Viriathus's camp. Viriathus, exhausted from years of ceaseless war, slept in his armor and allowed his closest friends into his tent at any hour of the night so that he could be summoned to command at a moment's notice. It was the security policy of a man who had lived on the edge of ambush for a decade. And it was, ironically, the exact loophole his killers needed. Audax, Ditalcus, and Menurus walked in during the night and cut his throat. In the morning, his men found him dead. The 3 murderers had already fled to the Roman lines. The Lusitanians, according to Appian, held a grand funeral. They dressed Viriathus in special garments, burned him on a pyre, with processions and gladiator battles and songs, and they searched for the killers so that they might avenge him. They never found them. They could not, because the killers had already been safely delivered to Rome. When they arrived at Caepio's camp to claim the rest of their payment, the Roman general reportedly turned them away with a phrase that has echoed through Iberian history for over 2,000 years: Rome does not pay traitors who murder their chief. The 3 men were dismissed, possibly executed. The Roman writer Eutropius records the same idea in slightly different words. It was never pleasing to the Romans. He says that a general should be killed by his own soldiers. Whether Caepio ever said the phrase or not, it captures a Roman contradiction so perfectly that Portugal and Spain still teach it in schools. Rome would happily pay to have you killed. Rome would not respect the men who killed you. Caepio was later denied a triumph by the Senate because the manner of the victory offended their sense of Roman dignity. And the fact that Viriathus, a mountain shepherd, had backed Rome into that particular corner, forcing them into an assassination that they themselves regarded as shameful, is exactly why he ranks this high. The German historian Theodor Mommsen said of him that it seemed in that thoroughly prosaic age as if one of the Homeric heroes had reappeared. To be the man for whom Rome broke its own rules and then punish the men who helped it break them is a strange kind of immortality. And at number 1, Bulla Felix. The Roman Empire, at the height of its power under Septimius Severus, produced many bandits, but it produced only one who ran his own personal shadow state in the Italian countryside for 2 full years, right at the doorstep of Rome, with 600 armed men and a spy network that reached into the imperial palace itself. His name, or the name given to him by the historian Cassius Dio, was Bulla Felix. Lucky charm, roughly. The name is so evocative, so on the nose for a legendary bandit, that some scholars suspect Dio may have partly invented him, or at least composed him from several real bandits into a single archetype. That is possible. What is not possible is that no such man existed at all, because the sociology behind him is exactly what we would expect from Septimius Severus's Italy, around 205 AD. While Septimius Severus was campaigning in Britain, Bulla assembled a force of runaway slaves, imperial freedmen, who had been cheated of their pay and mistreated household servants of the emperor himself. He organized them into a disciplined band. Some ancient writers even likened his group of 600 to the Roman Senate itself, which was almost exactly the same size, a mocking parallel that would not have been lost on Cassius Dio, himself a senator. And then he set out to embarrass Rome in a way no bandit had ever quite matched. His method was intelligence. Bulla knew who was leaving Rome, how many were in their party, what road they were traveling, and what they were carrying, often before the travelers themselves knew. Dio explicitly says his network monitored departures from Rome and arrivals at the port of Brundisium in the south. Merchants, aristocrats, and imperial couriers alike were intercepted, robbed, and, remarkably, released alive. Bulla did not kill his victims. He stripped them of their portable wealth and let them walk away. That policy alone made him something between a bandit and a folk hero. Runaway slaves flocked to him. Ordinary Italians whispered his name approvingly in taverns, and the emperor, hearing of these humiliations from thousands of miles away in Britain, seethed. Severus sent detachment after detachment to catch him. Bulla, using his network and his gift for disguise, slipped through every net. He was, in Dio's marvelous phrase, never really seen, when seen, never found, when found, never caught, when caught. Dio explains the trick. Bulla operated with such widely distributed intelligence and such deep bribery of the men sent to hunt him that every capture turned into a soft release. Roman soldiers who found him took his payment and let him vanish. Roman informants who claimed to have located him were half the time on his own payroll. He impersonated magistrates, he impersonated centurions, he bribed the men sent to arrest him. He even, on one occasion, freed 2 of his own men from prison by walking into the prison as a magistrate, pretending to want them for questioning, and walking them out again through the front gate under the salutes of the guards. And it was in this environment that the incident that opened this video took place. A centurion, sent under the emperor's personal instructions to hunt him down, was tricked into an ambush. Bulla convened a mock tribunal. He dressed himself as a Roman magistrate. He had the centurion's head partially shaved in the style used to mark runaway slaves. Then he released him with a message for the imperial court. Feed your slaves, or they will become bandits. It was not just an insult. It was a manifesto. Bulla was telling the emperor that his own criminal army existed because Rome's economy created it. Many of his men were imperial freedmen, former slaves of the emperor's own household who had been cheated out of the pay they were owed. Bulla was accusing Septimius Severus personally of building the very brigand army that was now robbing his roads. And the message was carried back to Rome by the emperor's own centurion walking half-bald into the imperial city. Severus finally understood that Bulla could not be caught by conventional pursuit. So he sent a tribune of his Praetorian Guard with a full squadron of cavalry and reportedly threatened the tribune with punishment if he failed. The tribune succeeded, but not through military skill. Through Bulla's one weakness. A woman he loved was found and turned informant. Betrayed in his own bed, Bulla was seized. He was brought before the Praetorian prefect Papinian, one of the greatest jurists of Roman history, who asked him a single legendary question. Why did you become a bandit? Bulla's answer, if Dio has it right, was as sharp as anything he had ever done. Why are you a prefect? The prefect stared. Then he ordered Bulla thrown to the beasts in the arena. The band of 600 dissolved without their leader. Rome breathed out, and Cassius Dio, writing decades later, made sure Bulla's face shaving of the centurion was preserved forever, because it was the moment when a bandit stopped being a criminal and became a permanent insult to the state that could not catch him. His name means lucky charm, and he was the only man on this list who managed, in the same career, to be both a highway robber and a walking political indictment of the empire he robbed. 10 criminals, 10 fortunes offered for their heads, a Cantabrian hyena who walked into an emperor's tent and collected his own bounty, a shadow army of Gaulish peasants who outlasted the empire that hunted them, a Mysian bandit who traded a fortress in the mountains for a priest-king's crown, a Sicilian robber dropped into an animal cage from a fake volcano built in the Roman Forum, a Numidian deserter who trained his army in Roman drill and demanded land from Tiberius as an equal, a Roman soldier who nearly assassinated an emperor at a spring carnival wearing Praetorian white, Egyptian herdsmen who ate a centurion's entrails in the marsh, an Isaurian butcher shot through a loophole by an engineer whose hand he had crippled, a Lusitanian shepherd stabbed in his sleep by 3 friends Rome paid and then would not honor, and a Roman lucky charm who told an emperor's centurion to feed his slaves. There is a lesson embedded in every one of these stories, and Rome only reluctantly learned it. Criminals did not rise from nowhere. They rose from the seams of an empire that squeezed too hard. Deserters came from legions that starved their soldiers or paid them late. Bandits came from provinces that taxed their farmers into flight. Priest kings came from bandits who noticed which side of a civil war was winning. Shepherds became warlords when Roman generals massacred them at peace conferences. Cannibalistic marsh dwellers rose when tax collectors demanded gold from herdsmen who had no gold to give. Every fortune Rome put on a wanted man's head was a receipt for something Rome had done to create him first. That is why Cassius Dio, writing about Bulla Felix at the height of imperial pomp, made sure his readers understood that the bandit's message about feeding slaves was the punchline of a much older joke on the Roman ruling class. It is why Herodian, reporting Maternus' near assassination of an emperor, took care to note that jealousy of a bandit chief among common men could rival loyalty to an emperor among the same men. It is why Tacitus lingered on Tacfarinas' insulting embassy to Tiberius, and why Zosimus recorded exactly which loophole in the wall of Cremna finally killed Lydius. These historians understood something the government they served often did not. That the men Rome pursued with the most terror were, in a strange way, holding up a mirror to Rome itself, and that more than any bounty is why these 10 names have survived 2,000 years. If this journey through the ancient world's most feared and most wanted has gripped you, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to show this to more people who love the corners of history that textbooks skip. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive. Turn on notifications so the algorithm cannot bury us, and drop a comment right now. Tell us which of these criminals surprised you the most. Was it Bulla shaving the centurion? Viriathus in his tent? Corocotta walking into the emperor's camp for his own bounty? Tell us where you are watching from. Our community spans the entire world, and every comment helps us keep bringing you the stories the empire tried to bury. Thank you for watching. These 10 names have outlived the empire that hunted them, and they deserve to be remembered.